Morning air in Winterfell was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and smoke from the kitchens, but beneath the calm surface, Ned Stark's mind was a storm. To the world, he was the honorable hand of the king, a man of unwavering principles, a loyal Stark, sworn to justice and truth. But no one knew the secret that burned in the depths of his heart, a plan that had been growing quietly over the years. The Lannisters were not just a threat to the realm, they were a threat to everything Ned held dear. He had watched from afar as their cunning and ambition spread like wildfire, threatening not only the north, but the very balance of Westeros. Their manipulation of the Iron Throne, their cruelty masked by charm and wealth, had earned them the loyalty of kings and knights, while leaving trails of broken lives in their wake. Ned could not abide it. He could not simply be a bystander in a game that he had sworn to play with honor. Every word he spoke in King Robert's presence, every hand he shook, every favor he granted, was calculated. He was the wolf in the shadow, waiting for the right moment to strike. His outward demeanor, stoic, straightforward, bound by stark duty, was his armor. No one suspected the depth of his discontent, the dark ambition that simmered beneath the surface. Even Catelyn, who had been by his side through the long winters and the hardest choices, had no idea that Ned had begun to weave threads of a plan that could topple a dynasty. He remembered the day he had returned from King's Landing after the first council meeting with Robert. The laughter and feigned respect of the Lannisters had grated on him like sandpaper. Tywin's proud gaze, Jaime's arrogant smirk, and Cersei's cold, calculating stare, they all reminded him why he could never trust them. They were predators disguised as nobility, and Ned knew that patience, secrecy, and subtlety were his only weapons. He had spent months quietly analyzing every Lannister move, every whisper in the Red Keep, every alliance and betrayal. Littlefinger's cunning, Varys, shadows, all of it played into the larger game he had decided to wage. Ned was not a man given to deceit lightly. In fact, deception made him uneasy, but necessity had sharpened his resolve. Honor and secrecy could coexist if wielded with precision, and he had resolved to become the master of both. He had begun to send messages under veiled pretenses to plant small seeds of distrust among the Lannisters' allies. A careless word here, a subtle rumor there, all meant to weaken the foundation of their power without ever revealing his hand. He would be forced, at times, to act contrary to everything he had taught his children, to act as if he was complicit in the corruption he secretly despised. It was a burden he bore in silence, a constant tension that weighed on him even as he carried out his duties in King Robert's court. Ned's mind often wandered to the fateful meeting with Jon Arryn, the late hand of the king, whose death had set many events into motion. Jon had whispered truths in confidence, hints of secrets hidden beneath the gold and silk of King's court. Ned had absorbed those whispers like a map of treachery, knowing they would serve him in ways Jon could never have imagined. As he walked the cold stone corridors of Winterfell that evening, the wind tugging at his cloak, Ned felt a sense of grim satisfaction. His children, unaware of the peril that lurked beyond the walls of their home, played and studied under his watchful eye, innocent in ways that he hoped would last. But he knew that Winterfell's safety depended not just on the strength of the walls or the loyalty of bannermen. It depended on his cunning, on his ability to think 10 steps ahead of a family that seemed invincible. Arya's defiance, Sansa's cautious grace, Bran's curiosity, Robb's untested leadership, and Rickon's playful innocence, all were pieces of a greater puzzle that Ned had begun to arrange in his mind. Each move he planned, each secret he kept, was meant to ensure that his family could survive the coming storm. Nights were the hardest, when the quiet of Winterfell allowed his thoughts to spiral into both hope and fear. He would lie awake, picturing confrontations in King's Landing, imagining the moment when the Lannisters would realize that the seemingly honorable hand of the king had been orchestrating a subtle, methodical campaign to undermine them. The thrill of it, the danger, and the moral weight of his actions pressed on him like a living thing. He could almost see Tywin's sharp eyes narrowing, Cersei's lips curling in disdain, Jaime's patience thinning, all because of decisions made in the shadows. Ned was a man divided between love and vengeance, honor and cunning, family and duty, and yet he could not bring himself to regret the path he had chosen. The realm was riddled with injustice, and if his actions could tip the scales toward balance, even if it meant embracing deception, then the risk was worth it. The first step, he knew, would be to secure allies, those who could act without question, whose loyalty could be bought or inspired through subtle influence. He would need whispers, forged documents, and carefully placed provocations, all leading to cracks in the Lannister armor. And above all, patience. The Lannisters were not to be destroyed through brute force. They were to be undone from within by manipulating pride, envy, and fear. As the torchlight flickered along the cold walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of the past, Ned felt the weight of history pressing on him. He was not merely a man seeking revenge. He was a Stark, carrying the legacy of the North, determined to right a wrong that had festered too long in the heart of the realm. Outside, the wind howled across the battlements, a reminder that the world beyond Winterfell was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Inside, Ned's plan was taking shape, quiet and deliberate, like the patient weaving of a spider's web. And when the moment came, he knew the Lannisters would find themselves ensnared, powerless against a man whose honor was only a mask, and whose resolve was colder and sharper than Valyrian steel. Ned Stark rode south with his daughters and a heavy heart, knowing that King's Landing would test every ounce of his resolve. The city was alive with opulence and deception, a place where smiles could hide daggers and loyalty could shift as easily as the wind. From the moment he entered the Red Keep, the air seemed charged with whispers he could almost hear if he listened closely enough. Every conversation was layered, every glance a subtle threat. Ned knew he had to play the part of the dutiful hand, the honorable man who would never bend to corruption, all while weaving his intricate plan in secret. He had already begun to plant the seeds of his scheme, small nudges designed to exploit the arrogance of the Lannisters. A careless word in a council meeting, a hint of mistrust dropped in passing, each action calculated to set the stage for a future confrontation they could not foresee. Robert Baratheon, his old friend and king, still reveled in his own indulgences, oblivious to the subtleties of the game playing out before him. Ned could not rely on Robert to see the danger. It was up to him alone. As he navigated the corridors of power, he found himself observing the Lannisters with a hawk-like gaze. Tywin's calculated silence, Jaime's smug confidence, Cersei's poisonous charm, all were elements to be exploited. Ned's mind raced with possibilities, imagining how a single misstep or well-placed rumor could unravel their carefully constructed facade. The stakes were higher than ever. Any slip could cost him everything, not just his position, but his family, his honor, and perhaps his life. Yet he welcomed the danger. The tension in King's Landing was suffocating, but it was also the perfect breeding ground for intrigue. Ned had already begun to cultivate allies who understood subtlety and secrecy, men and women who were loyal to the North and shared his vision of justice. Some were obvious choices, like loyal bannermen who had long-standing respect for the Starks. Others were hidden, minor players whose ambition could be redirected to serve his purpose. Each contact, each secret meeting, was carefully timed, ensuring no one suspected the true scope of his intentions. Catelyn had initially questioned his journey south, worried for their children and the dangers of the royal court, but Ned had reassured her with a steady gaze that hid the storm beneath. He could not reveal the full plan, for even a whisper of his intentions could be deadly if it reached the wrong ears. Every decision, from dinner seating to council protocol, became a tool in his quiet war. Even small gestures carried weight, a smile too sharp, a nod too slow, a subtle expression that could be interpreted in multiple ways. Ned had become a master of control, masking his intentions with the very honor that the Lannisters had underestimated. The first major move came in the form of subtle inquiries into the loyalties of key players. Ned listened more than he spoke, asked questions that seemed innocent but carried double meanings. He probed the weaknesses of the Lannisters' allies, discovering old grudges, buried fears, and petty jealousies that could be fanned into flames. One evening, he met with Varys, the master of whisperers, under the guise of seeking counsel about the state of the realm. Varys, ever observant, was intrigued by Ned's subtle hints and careful phrasing. He did not suspect that Ned was maneuvering against one of the most dangerous families in Westeros. Instead, he assumed the hand was merely seeking information to serve justice. In truth, Ned was learning every thread of information that could be used to unravel the Lannisters' influence. Jaime's reputation as the Kingslayer and Cersei's ruthless ambition became focal points in his strategy. Ned understood that striking directly at the Lannisters would be foolish. They were too powerful, too protected by fear and wealth. Instead, he focused on turning their own arrogance against them. A careless insult whispered into the ears of a trusted bannerman, a secret favor granted to a minor courtier, all were parts of a larger design that would make the Lannisters believe they were safe, all while their enemies moved silently around them. Even as he worked, Ned struggled with the weight of the deception. He had spent a lifetime preaching honor and duty to his children, and yet here he was, weaving a web of secrets and half-truths. The moral tension was almost unbearable, but he reminded himself that the ends justified the means. His vision was not born of greed or vengeance, but of necessity. If the Lannisters were allowed to continue unchecked, their influence would corrupt the realm entirely. And yet, amid all this calculation, Ned never lost sight of his children. Letters from Winterfell, sent through trusted ravens, reminded him of Arya's fiery spirit, Sansa's keen intelligence, and Robb's emerging leadership. He thought often of how the North must remain strong and vigilant, how the blood of Stark had to endure. Protecting his family became both his motivation and his moral compass. It was the reason he tolerated Robert's obliviousness, the reason he played the game with careful restraint, and the reason he endured the constant tension of the court. Nights in the Red Keep were particularly challenging. Ned would sit alone in his chambers, quill in hand, mapping out the sequence of events he hoped to orchestrate. Each note, each calculation, was a step toward dismantling a family that had underestimated him at every turn. The city outside was alive with treachery, and Ned felt the pulse of danger like a heartbeat in the walls. Every shadow was a potential enemy, every whisper a test of his resolve. He began planting rumors that hinted at internal strife among the Lannisters, playing on Cersei's vanity and Tywin's pride. Even Jaime, whose loyalty was assumed by many, became a pawn in the subtle games of manipulation. Ned knew the timing had to be perfect. Too early, and he would be exposed; too late, and the Lannisters would act first. As the weeks passed, Ned's plan gained momentum. Minor events began to unfold exactly as he had foreseen, small cracks appearing in the facade of Lannister unity. A misplaced document here, a misinterpreted message there, and he saw the beginnings of distrust spreading among their allies. The thrill of success was tempered by constant vigilance. A single mistake could undo months of preparation. And yet, despite the weight of secrecy and the strain on his conscience, Ned felt a grim satisfaction. He was no longer just the honorable hand. He was a strategist, a protector, a silent force shaping the fate of Westeros. He knew the road ahead would be dangerous, that the consequences of discovery could be fatal, but he also knew that once the plan reached fruition, the North and his family would be safer than they had ever been. For the first time in his life, Ned Stark allowed himself a small measure of hope, even as the shadows of the Red Keep pressed close, and the Golden Lion of House Lannister prowled unseen, unaware of the storm silently gathering at its gates. By the time the spring sun had begun to warm the streets of King's Landing, Ned Stark's plan had moved from whispers to subtle actions, each one carefully calculated to unsettle the Lannisters without revealing his hand. Every day he walked the halls of the Red Keep, he observed them with a hawk's precision, noting the smallest shifts in demeanor, the briefest flashes of irritation or suspicion. Cersei, ever the queen of subtle manipulation, had begun to grow restless, her sharp eyes catching fragments of rumor that seemed to drift through the court like smoke. She did not yet know that it was Ned who had started the fire. Jaime, arrogant and assured in his own skill, remained outwardly calm, but Ned saw the tension in the way his hand lingered near his sword, the slight stiffening of his shoulders when certain words were spoken. Tywin, the lion himself, remained the hardest to read. His pride and discipline made him seem invincible, yet even he could be influenced by careful nudges and expertly timed provocations. Ned began meeting with courtiers and minor lords who were either loyal to the North or disillusioned by Lannister dominance. He treated them with fairness and a measured generosity that earned their trust, all the while planting seeds of doubt and encouraging subtle rivalries. A misplaced comment about Tywin's absent hand in the council, a questioning glance at Jaime's loyalty, a sympathetic ear to Cersei's rivals, All were threads woven into a complex tapestry of manipulation. Even Varys, the master of whispers, became a tool in Ned's plan, unwittingly delivering messages that sowed distrust among the Lannisters' allies. Ned's skill lay not in brute force or open confrontation, but in understanding human nature, in seeing the desires, fears, and weaknesses that could be exploited. And yet, despite the growing tension he had created, he remained outwardly steadfast in his loyalty to the king. Robert continued to revel in hunting, feasts, and wine, oblivious to the subtle war brewing under his own roof. Ned had to be careful not to let the king's ignorance become a liability. Every maneuver required precision. A word said too plainly could alert the Lannisters. A hesitation could betray his true intentions. He walked a razor's edge, balancing honor with necessity, morality with pragmatism. His nightly musings became increasingly strategic. Ned kept detailed notes of interactions, recording who might be swayed, who was already inclined toward discontent, and which Lannisters were most vulnerable to manipulation. Each note was a potential lever, each observation a tool to pry apart the bonds of power that the Lannisters had so carefully constructed. Arya's letters from Winterfell reached him in the evenings, filled with youthful impatience and tales of small adventures, but they reminded him why his secrecy was essential. Robb's first attempts at leadership among the young Stark bannermen were cautious, yet promising, and Ned's mind often wandered to how the lessons he imparted in Winterfell could one day be applied to protect the North from outside threats. Meanwhile, the city itself became a stage for his plan. Ned noticed the petty rivalries among courtiers, the simmering jealousy of minor lords, and the quiet resentment some held toward the Lannisters' wealth and influence. He gently encouraged these tensions, allowing them to fester while remaining above suspicion. Even the smallest victory, a lord questioning Tywin's intentions or a servant whispering a rumor about Jaime's loyalty, was celebrated in the privacy of his mind. Ned had to remain patient. He understood that dismantling a family as powerful as the Lannisters could not happen overnight. He had already witnessed the dangers of acting too quickly, too openly. The lessons of the past, of Jon Arryn's sudden death, and the fragility of political alliances weighed heavily on him. One evening, Ned found himself walking the narrow corridors of the Red Keep, thinking about Cersei and her ever-watchful eyes. He had carefully arranged a series of correspondences that suggested mistrust among her allies, planting doubts that would eventually erode her confidence. His methods were subtle, a misdelivered letter here, a conversation overheard there, each designed to appear as coincidence, as the natural consequence of ambition and fear. Yet the strain of secrecy was taxing. Ned, a man who valued directness and honor above all else, found himself increasingly relying on manipulation and artifice. He justified it as necessary for the protection of his family and the realm, but the moral burden pressed on him relentlessly. Even as he planned against the Lannisters, he remained committed to the principles he held dear, ensuring that his actions would not create collateral damage among innocents. The first tangible success of his plan came in the form of a dispute between Jaime and Tywin. A small rumor, whispered by a loyal bannerman at Ned's suggestion, cast doubt on Jaime's loyalty to his father and his sister. Tywin, proud and sensitive to questions of loyalty, began to observe his son more critically, noting every slip, every hesitation. Jaime, in turn, grew frustrated by the subtle scrutiny, unaware that his own reactions were being anticipated and guided by Ned's design. Cersei's behavior became increasingly erratic as well. The carefully planted seeds of mistrust began to take root in her mind, amplifying her paranoia. She questioned her advisors, her allies, and even Jaime himself, unaware that the calm, seemingly honorable hand of the king was the true architect of the unease gnawing at her family. Ned also understood the importance of perception. To the outside world, he was still the loyal, dutiful Stark who sought only justice and the well-being of the realm. His reputation for integrity became a shield, preventing others from suspecting the extent of his secret campaign. Even Robert's most trusted advisors had no inkling of his true intentions. As the days passed, Ned's confidence in his plan grew, though he never allowed complacency to take hold. He knew the Lannisters were dangerous, cunning, and unpredictable. A single misstep could unravel months of careful plotting, but he trusted in his patience, his ability to anticipate their moves, and his understanding of the weaknesses they so often tried to hide. The Red Keep, with its glittering halls and hidden corridors, became both his battlefield and his sanctuary. Each meeting, each council session, each casual conversation was a move in a game that only Ned fully understood. He had transformed from the honorable hand into a strategist, a man willing to bend and adapt while maintaining the illusion of uprightness. And through it all, he never lost sight of his ultimate goal: to protect his family, safeguard the North, and ensure that the Lannisters, who had caused so much corruption and suffering, would be brought low, not by brute force alone, but by cunning, patience, and an unwavering mind that never wavered, even in the face of danger that would have crushed lesser men. The first cracks had appeared, and Ned Stark watched carefully as the Golden Lion of House Lannister began to feel the subtle pressure of a wolf's jaws closing silently around it. The tension in King's Landing was growing with every passing day, though most of the court remained blissfully unaware of the storm gathering in the shadows. Ned Stark moved carefully, his mind constantly weighing the next step, the next conversation, the next subtle nudge that could destabilize the Lannisters without alerting them to his intentions. He had learned that overt action would be dangerous. The Lannisters were far too cunning, far too well protected. Instead, he relied on insinuations, rumors, and the occasional carefully phrased question to make them doubt themselves and each other. A single misstep from any of them, and the seeds he had planted would begin to sprout, creating fractures in their seemingly unbreakable unity. Ned had come to understand that people's weaknesses were rarely physical. They were emotional, psychological, and most importantly, predictable when observed carefully. Cersei's vanity and suspicion, Jaime's arrogance and need for approval, Tywin's pride and obsession with legacy, all these were levers Ned could use to manipulate outcomes in subtle but profound ways. He began orchestrating small public incidents that seemed like coincidence, yet in truth were carefully choreographed tests. A misdelivered message, a courtier overhearing a conversation, a whispered comment in the right ear, all of it was designed to make the Lannisters feel the first hints of unease. One evening, during a council meeting, Ned casually asked a question about the deployment of troops in the Riverlands, phrasing it in a way that implied the Lannisters might be overreaching. Jaime's response was measured but tinged with irritation, and Tywin's subtle tightening of his jaw did not escape Ned's notice. These small cracks were exactly what he needed. They suggested that tension and doubt were beginning to creep into the Lannisters' confidence, even among their most loyal allies. In the weeks that followed, Ned continued to work the court from behind the scenes. He cultivated alliances with minor lords and advisors who were disillusioned by the growing dominance of the Lannisters, giving them just enough encouragement to act, but never enough to reveal his own role. Letters and messages were carefully routed through trusted intermediaries, ensuring that his involvement remained hidden while the seeds of discord grew. Ned also understood the value of timing. He waited patiently for the right moments to strike, moments when the Lannisters' own arrogance and overconfidence would make them vulnerable. A single word at the wrong time could either alert them to his schemes or accelerate the collapse he sought to engineer. He had learned to be meticulous, almost surgical in his approach, knowing that patience was the greatest weapon in this quiet war. Meanwhile, the moral weight of his secret actions continued to press upon him. Ned had always prided himself on honesty and honor, but now he had to compromise those ideals for the greater good. He reminded himself constantly that the ends justified the means, that the safety of his family and the stability of the realm depended on his ability to act in the shadows. His nights were spent alone, analyzing the reactions of the Lannisters to his subtle manipulations, recalibrating his approach with every new observation. It was exhausting work, both mentally and emotionally, but Ned took solace in knowing that he was in control, shaping events rather than reacting to them. As the days grew longer and the political currents in King's Landing became more volatile, Ned began testing the loyalty of key Lannister allies. He planted small suggestions of betrayal, hints that some of their most trusted supporters might be turning against them. At first, these whispers were met with disbelief and dismissal, but over time, even the most confident courtiers began to question the solidity of the Lannisters' network. Ned's plan relied on subtlety, but it also required him to play a dangerous game of perception. He had to maintain his reputation as the honorable hand while simultaneously orchestrating chaos beneath the surface. This duality weighed heavily on him, but he found strength in the knowledge that every careful action brought him closer to his ultimate goal, dismantling a family whose pride and ambition had poisoned the realm for too long. One of the pivotal moments came during a banquet meant to celebrate Robert's recent hunting successes. Ned used the gathering as a stage to observe interactions and plant seeds of mistrust. A casual remark about Tywin's rumored dissatisfaction with certain bannermen was overheard by the right people, and subtle glances and gestures set the wheels of suspicion turning. Cersei, in particular, began to show signs of paranoia, questioning even her closest confidants. Jaime, while outwardly composed, revealed small signs of irritation that Ned noted carefully for future reference. Even Robert, drunk and boisterous as usual, inadvertently provided opportunities for Ned to maneuver his plan, as his lack of attention left gaps in the court's defenses. Ned also began to consider the use of more direct tactics, though always carefully veiled. He arranged for certain documents to accidentally fall into the hands of Lannister supporters, documents that suggested rivalries or conflicts where none had existed. He encouraged minor disputes between Lannister allies, allowing them to fester and grow until even Tywin began to notice subtle signs of instability. All of this required extraordinary patience. Ned had to anticipate every reaction, every possible counter, and every unintended consequence. One misstep could expose him and endanger his family, or worse, result in his own death. Yet despite the risks, he felt a grim satisfaction. Each small victory, each minor disruption, was proof that his plan was working, proof that the Lannisters' pride and ambition could be turned against them. As spring gave way to early summer, Ned realized that he had achieved the first critical phase of his scheme. He had successfully introduced doubt into the Lannisters' inner circle, creating fissures that, while still small, could be widened over time. The family that had seemed untouchable was beginning to show signs of vulnerability, and Ned knew that the next steps would require even greater cunning. He began preparing for those next moves, carefully considering how to exploit every weakness and seize every opportunity that arose. And through it all, he kept one constant in his mind: his family. Every action he took, every risk he accepted, was in service of protecting the Starks and ensuring that the North would endure. His children remained unaware of the dangerous game unfolding around them, their innocence preserved by his careful secrecy. Ned's resolve hardened with each passing day. The Lannisters might control wealth, influence, and appearances, but they underestimated the quiet, patient power of a man who had watched, learned, and planned for years. The wolf could wait, strike silently, and never reveal its true strength until the moment was perfect. And Ned Stark, honorable in the eyes of the world but cunning in the shadows, was ready to unleash that power when the time came, knowing that the fate of Westeros and his family depended on every calculated move he made. By midsummer, the subtle tension Ned had been cultivating began to bloom into something far more tangible. The Lannisters, who had once seemed untouchable, were now beginning to squirm under the weight of whispered doubts and carefully planted seeds of distrust. Ned Stark had spent months observing every twitch, every glance, every carefully concealed emotion, and now the fruits of patience were beginning to show. Cersei's smiles, once smooth and practiced, had started to falter, her eyes darting to advisors and courtiers with suspicion. Jaime's confidence, normally unshakable, had developed cracks, small but noticeable to anyone trained to observe. And Tywin, proud, calculating, and always several steps ahead of most, had begun to sense undercurrents in his own court that he could not quite name. Ned had no illusions. He knew the danger of being discovered at this stage could be fatal, but he had prepared for it meticulously. Every move he made had contingencies, every action had layers, and every word he spoke was weighted with purpose. As the days passed, he began to introduce more direct interventions. During council meetings, he framed questions in ways that highlighted Lannister weaknesses without appearing to do so. A casual remark about strategic loyalty might lead to a small argument between Jaime and one of Tywin's trusted allies. An offhand observation about the stability of the Riverlands could provoke an overreaction from Cersei, who saw threats in places that did not exist. Ned's brilliance lay in subtlety. He did not need to confront the Lannisters openly. Instead, he guided events from the shadows, turning their own pride and paranoia into weapons against them. One afternoon, he arranged a series of private discussions with several minor lords, men who had felt slighted or ignored under Lannister rule. He listened patiently to their grievances, carefully validating their concerns, and then suggested courses of action that seemed their own but were entirely in line with his plan. By the end of the day, rivalries had deepened, loyalties were questioned, and the Lannisters' influence had subtly weakened without them realizing who had caused it. Even Robert, in his drunken oblivion, became an unwitting tool in Ned's scheme. By providing opportunities for the king to speak carelessly in public, Ned created situations where the Lannisters could be misinterpreted or appear incompetent. It was a dangerous game, but one that Ned played with relentless focus. Nights were often the hardest. In the quiet of his chambers, Ned pored over notes, letters, and observations, cataloging every reaction, every glance, every subtle change in demeanor. He reviewed every council meeting in his mind, every whispered conversation in the halls, and every rumor that had begun to take hold among the courtiers. The mental toll was immense, but Ned drew strength from the knowledge that each careful calculation was bringing him closer to his goal. The turning point, Ned knew, would come when he could force the Lannisters to act rashly, to betray their own allies through paranoia and mistrust. To achieve this, he began planting evidence of betrayals that did not exist, carefully crafting situations in which Cersei, Jaime, and Tywin would see enemies where none were present. The plan required delicate timing. If the Lannisters suspected manipulation too early, they could consolidate power and strike against him before the plan could reach its critical phase. But Ned's patience and meticulous planning allowed him to maintain the perfect balance between pressure and concealment. One evening, during a particularly tense council session, Ned subtly highlighted a conflict between two Lannister allies, framing it as an urgent matter that required immediate attention. The conversation ignited a chain reaction. Cersei's suspicion flared, Jaime's arrogance clashed with the rival lord, and Tywin's measured control began to slip as he attempted to manage the situation. The cracks were no longer subtle, they were beginning to widen. Outside of council, Ned continued his network of influence. Courtiers, advisors, and minor lords began to question their loyalties quietly, unsure if they could fully trust the Lannisters. Ned provided just enough guidance to ensure that their actions aligned with his plan while leaving no trace of his involvement. Each success reinforced his confidence and allowed him to escalate the campaign in small, controlled steps. At the same time, he remained mindful of the moral line he could not cross. Ned did not seek unnecessary bloodshed or innocent casualties. His goal was the strategic dismantling of a corrupt and overreaching family, not the destruction of innocence. Even as he orchestrated conflicts, he ensured that harm was contained to those whose pride and ambition had made them vulnerable to his influence. The strain of secrecy weighed heavily on him, particularly as he thought of Catelyn and their children. He longed for the comfort of Winterfell, the simple clarity of the North, and the warmth of his family. Yet he knew that to protect them, he had to endure the pressures of the Red Keep, to maintain the mask of loyalty and honor while orchestrating the quiet downfall of the Lannisters. Slowly, Ned began to see the pattern emerge. The Lannisters were responding exactly as he had predicted. Minor allies became hesitant, rivalries flared, and even the most disciplined courtiers began to make mistakes. The family's unity, once so formidable, was beginning to show signs of strain. Ned's patience and careful planning were paying off, and he allowed himself a quiet satisfaction, but he remained vigilant. One misstep, one exposure, could reverse all progress and place not only him, but his entire family in mortal danger. As summer progressed, Ned's network of influence expanded. He found that even small, seemingly insignificant actions could yield substantial results if executed correctly. A casual question about troop placement might provoke a minor lord into overstepping authority, A subtle suggestion of rivalry could cause an alliance to fray. A carefully planted rumor could inspire doubt in the most steadfast supporters of the Lannisters. Each outcome was meticulously documented in Ned's mind, analyzed for patterns, and used to guide future actions. Despite the mounting tension and increasing danger, Ned never wavered in his resolve. He understood that history favored the patient and the perceptive, and he intended to see his plan through to the end. The Lannisters, for all their wealth and cunning, were vulnerable to a man who could read the subtleties of human behavior and exploit them with precision. In the quiet moments between council sessions and private meetings, Ned reflected on the stakes. He was playing a dangerous game, one that required constant vigilance and absolute focus. But he also knew that the potential rewards were immense: the preservation of his family, the protection of the North, and the weakening of a family whose corruption threatened the entire realm. And so, with each passing day, Ned Stark continued to maneuver in the shadows, a wolf among lions, patiently tightening the web he had begun to weave. He was aware that the Lannisters would not remain unaware forever, but by the time they realized the danger, it would already be too late. Their pride, ambition, and arrogance would be their undoing, and Ned's careful strategy would leave them vulnerable, exposed, and eventually defeated. The Red Keep, glittering and deceptive, had become both his battlefield and his canvas. Every action he took, every word he spoke, every subtle gesture was a brushstroke in a work of strategy that would ultimately decide the fate of the North, his family. And the Lannisters themselves. Ned Stark, honorable in the eyes of all, yet cunning and patient in secret, moved closer to the climax of a plan that had begun long before his arrival in King's Landing, a plan that, if executed correctly, would reshape the power of Westeros forever. The tension in King's Landing had reached a level that even the most oblivious courtiers could sense. Whispers of discord floated through the corridors like smoke, small but persistent, and the Lannisters began to feel the pressure even if they could not yet see its source. Ned Stark had orchestrated it all, each subtle move carefully calculated to exploit their weaknesses, and now the first major consequences of his plan were beginning to unfold. It started with Jaime, whose overconfidence and need for validation made him vulnerable. A minor dispute, carefully orchestrated by Ned's intermediaries, spiraled into a confrontation between Jaime and one of Tywin's key allies, a man whose loyalty had been artificially cast into doubt. Jaime, infuriated by the perceived betrayal, reacted in anger, giving Tywin the impression that his son could not be trusted to control his impulses. This misstep set off a chain reaction. Cersei, already paranoid from Ned's earlier manipulations, became increasingly erratic, questioning every loyal advisor and suspiciously eyeing Jaime as if he might secretly betray her for personal gain. She began confiding in only a select few, cutting off some allies entirely and leaving gaps in her network of information. Tywin, ever the calculating father, noticed these small fissures and began to investigate, yet Ned's careful orchestration meant that each of Tywin's inquiries led him deeper into confusion rather than clarity. He was chasing shadows that did not exist, reacting to a web of deceit woven entirely by the Northern Hand. Ned's advantage lay in patience and precision. He had observed every member of the Lannister family for months, anticipating reactions and planting the seeds of misperception so that they acted exactly as he had predicted. His plan required this stage. The family had to begin unraveling from within, driven by paranoia, pride, and fear, without ever suspecting that the honorable Ned Stark was the architect of their discomfort. Meanwhile, the minor lords and courtiers Ned had cultivated as allies began to act independently, emboldened by subtle encouragements and carefully planted doubts. A question here, a comment there, a whispered suggestion of loyalty tested in the wrong way, all of it created a sense of instability in the Lannisters' court. Ned monitored these developments with meticulous attention, tracking reactions, predicting outcomes, and adjusting his strategy as needed. Each day brought new evidence that his plan was working, and yet the stakes only grew higher. One evening, Ned observed Cersei confront a supposedly loyal courtier over a misinterpreted conversation that Ned had subtly arranged to be overheard. The courtier, terrified and confused, faltered under Cersei's scrutiny, revealing nothing of substance, yet confirming her suspicions in her own mind. This tiny victory reinforced Ned's belief in the power of careful manipulation and patient observation. However, he was not blind to the dangers that surrounded him. The Red Keep was a labyrinth of intrigue, and a single misstep could expose him, leading to ruin for himself and his family. Every word, every glance, every conversation required precise control, yet the tension invigorated him, sharpening his focus and resolve. Ned also began leveraging Robert's ignorance as a tool. The king, blissfully unaware of the machinations around him, made public statements that Ned could twist subtly to reinforce the Lannisters' insecurities. Robert's carelessness became an unwitting ally, providing opportunities to misdirect suspicion and manipulate outcomes without revealing Ned's hand. As the first cracks widened, Ned prepared for the next phase, direct confrontation with key Lannister figures in controlled situations that would further destabilize their family. He began arranging private discussions, council meetings, and strategic encounters designed to provoke calculated responses. Each encounter was planned to maximize the effect of doubt and suspicion while minimizing the risk of exposure. The most delicate of these maneuvers involved Cersei. Ned knew that her ambition and paranoia were powerful tools, but also dangerous if mishandled. He began subtly questioning her judgment in ways that appeared innocent yet planted seeds of uncertainty. He praised her political acumen in one moment, then casually implied a potential misstep in another. Cersei's reactions were exactly as he anticipated. Her paranoia grew, and she became increasingly isolated, turning inward and relying on a shrinking circle of allies. Jaime, seeing his sister's growing instability, became frustrated and reactive, which only deepened Tywin's concern. It was a masterstroke of subtle manipulation. The family was unraveling from within, guided by the invisible hand of a man they believed was honorable and loyal. In the midst of these events, Ned continued to communicate with his northern allies. Letters from Winterfell provided updates on Robb's leadership and the loyalty of northern bannermen, reminding Ned why his secrecy was essential. Arya's spirited tales and Sansa's cautious observations of court life reinforced the importance of his mission. Every action, every risk, every carefully placed manipulation was aimed at securing a future where the North and his family could survive the treacherous politics of King's Landing. Ned's nightly reflections became both strategy sessions and meditations on morality. He acknowledged the tension between honor and necessity, knowing that the deception he employed, while morally uncomfortable, was necessary for the protection of the greater good. He reminded himself that he was not acting out of vengeance, but of responsibility, and that the eventual outcome would justify the means. As summer edged toward late season, the Red Keep became a place of constant tension. Courtiers whispered behind closed doors, alliances were questioned, and minor lords began to act independently in ways that destabilized the Lannisters' power. Ned's network of influence had become a machine operating silently, subtly guiding events without revealing the master behind the curtain. Then came the first overt sign that the Lannisters were feeling real pressure. A council meeting meant to discuss troop deployments in the Riverlands turned into an unplanned confrontation. Jaime, frustrated by previous manipulations, argued with a northern ally over perceived loyalty, while Cersei accused another courtier of hidden treachery. Tywin attempted to mediate, but even his formidable presence could not fully restore order. Ned watched quietly, ensuring that each move reinforced the fractures he had engineered. The Lannisters were reacting as predicted, their pride, ambition, and paranoia driving them toward conflict even when no real threat existed. The sense of satisfaction Ned felt was tempered by caution. He knew that the stakes had never been higher, that one miscalculation could undo months of work and place his family in mortal danger. Yet the careful precision of his planning allowed him to navigate this danger with confidence. He had accounted for countless possibilities, and even unexpected reactions were anticipated and incorporated into his evolving strategy. As the Red Keep settled into uneasy calm that evening, Ned reflected on the progress he had made. The first phase of his plan, introducing doubt, creating fractures, and provoking subtle reactions, was nearly complete. The family that had seemed untouchable was beginning to feel the invisible pressure of a wolf waiting to strike. The next phase would require even greater skill, exploiting those fractures to force critical errors, weaken alliances, and bring the Lannisters to the brink of collapse. Yet even as he prepared for this next stage, Ned remained vigilant. He could not allow overconfidence to blind him to risk. Every interaction, every move, every conversation was still a potential trap, and he had to remain one step ahead of the most cunning family in Westeros. The Red Keep had become both a battlefield and a chessboard, and Ned Stark, honorable in appearance but cunning in secret, was the unseen strategist orchestrating a game that would determine the fate of his family, the North, and the Lannisters themselves. The stakes had never been higher, and the wolf was ready to strike when the time was right, patient, relentless, and utterly precise. By late summer, the intricate web Ned Stark had woven around the Lannisters was beginning to tighten with an almost tangible pressure. Every carefully placed rumor, every subtle provocation, every manipulated interaction was coalescing into a force that the proud Lannisters could no longer ignore. Cersei's paranoia had reached a boiling point. She scrutinized every glance, every word, and every minor gesture in a court already tense with suspicion. Even Jaime, usually confident and brash, found himself second-guessing his own decisions, irritated by imagined slights and fearing that every conversation could be a trap. Tywin, for all his discipline and cunning, began to grow restless. The once unshakable foundation of his power now had cracks that he could sense but could not pinpoint, leading him to overcorrect, micromanage, and alienate some of his most loyal allies. Ned observed all of this with quiet satisfaction, yet he was not complacent. The greatest danger came now, not from a lack of progress, but from the risk of exposure. The Lannisters' increasing suspicion of each other could easily shift toward him if he made a single mistake. Every word, every gesture, and every counsel he offered had to be perfect, maintaining the facade of honor while orchestrating chaos in the shadows. He had already begun the next stage of his plan, testing the Lannisters directly. A meeting was arranged under the guise of discussing the allocation of forces to the Riverlands. In truth, it was a carefully staged confrontation designed to highlight fractures in their unity. Ned asked questions that seemed straightforward, but their phrasing implied a lack of trust in certain Lannister decisions. Jaime responded defensively, his irritation visible despite attempts at composure. Cersei interjected, accusing minor allies of disloyalty, her paranoia escalating as she perceived threats where none existed. Tywin attempted to restore order, but Ned had anticipated his moves. Each reaction played into the larger design, subtly widening the fissures in the Lannister household. Outside the council chambers, Ned's network of northern allies and strategically influenced courtiers continued to act, further destabilizing the Lannisters' position. Messages were accidentally overheard, letters went astray, and whispered rumors about loyalty and betrayal spread like wildfire among those who had previously been unquestioningly aligned with the Lion family. Even small mistakes by Lannister supporters were magnified and misinterpreted, creating tension and suspicion that Ned carefully documented for future use. Despite the increasing strain, Ned's conscience weighed heavily on him. Every act of manipulation was justified by necessity, yet he could not ignore the moral conflict that came with deception. He reminded himself constantly that this was not for personal gain, but to protect his family and the North, and to curb the Lannisters' destructive influence before it spread further. The stakes, however, were higher than ever. Any misstep could unravel everything he had worked for and place not only himself, but his family in grave danger. Ned could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him, yet he also felt a grim determination. The Lannisters had underestimated the wolf, and soon the consequences of that miscalculation would become evident. One evening, Ned arranged a private meeting with a key northern ally stationed in King's Landing. They discussed troop movements, the loyalties of minor lords, and subtle strategies for creating further doubt among the Lannisters' ranks. These conversations were layered with nuance and misdirection, designed to both inform his ally and protect his own secrets. Each detail was carefully considered, ensuring that the ally would act in accordance with Ned's larger plan without ever fully understanding the scope of the strategy. Meanwhile, the Lannisters, internal conflicts escalated. Cersei, convinced that Jaime's loyalty was wavering, began to withdraw from certain political decisions, consulting only a small circle of advisors whose own loyalties were questionable. Jaime's frustration grew as he tried to manage conflicts that seemed to arise from nowhere, unaware that Ned's subtle manipulations were orchestrating them. Tywin, attempting to assert control, often overreacted to perceived threats, pushing some of his most competent allies away and creating further instability. Ned observed all of this from the shadows, knowing that the moment of decisive action was approaching. He began to prepare for the stage in which these fractures could be exploited to force critical errors. It was a dangerous phase. The Lannisters could still retaliate if they sensed manipulation, but Ned's careful planning, patience, and anticipation had positioned him to act with precision. He also continued to use Robert's obliviousness as a tool. The king's careless remarks and indulgences created opportunities for the Lannisters to overextend themselves, act rashly, or misinterpret situations, all without realizing that the hand was orchestrating the outcomes. Every council session, every public event, and every private conversation was a potential instrument in Ned's strategy, and he treated each with meticulous care. Amidst the strategic maneuvering, Ned remained acutely aware of his family. Letters from Winterfell reminded him of Arya's rebellious curiosity, Sansa's perceptive intelligence, and Robb's developing leadership. Rickon's innocence, though the youngest and least politically aware, was a reminder of what was at stake. Every step of his plan was intended to protect them from the far-reaching influence of the Lannisters and secure the North's position in the shifting landscape of Westeros. The first direct consequence of Ned's manipulations occurred during a council session in which Cersei accused a loyal Lannister supporter of betrayal. The accusation, carefully seeded by Ned's network, caused a heated argument between allies, leading to public embarrassment and mistrust. Jaime attempted to intervene, but his anger and frustration only escalated the situation. Tywin, attempting to mediate, became visibly agitated, his normally precise control faltering as the chaos intensified. Ned remained outwardly composed, offering measured counsel and calm observation, all while internally noting the exact effects of his strategy. The fractures in the Lannister household became more pronounced with each passing day. Minor alliances weakened, loyalties shifted, and confidence eroded. Ned's plan was nearing its climax, and he began to consider the precise moment to press his advantage fully. The Red Keep, once a place of apparent order and stability, had become a labyrinth of suspicion, tension, and subtle conflict, all orchestrated by a man who, to all appearances, remained the honorable hand of the king. Even as the Lannisters' vulnerabilities became more evident, Ned remained vigilant. One wrong step, one moment of carelessness, could expose him, undo months of careful planning, and place his family in mortal danger. He moved with the patience of a predator, aware that the moment to strike decisively had not yet arrived, yet confident that the moment was approaching. The wolf waited, quiet and unseen, as the prideful lion began to falter. In the privacy of his chambers, Ned reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had transformed from a man defined solely by honor into a strategist capable of navigating a world of deception and manipulation without losing sight of his principles. The balance of morality and necessity weighed heavily on him, but the stakes demanded such a duality. His family's safety, the stability of the North, and the future of Westeros depended on the careful orchestration of every action, every word, and every subtle influence he wielded. And as the sun set over King's Landing, casting long shadows across the Red Keep, Ned Stark remained vigilant, patient, and determined. The Lannisters' pride, ambition, and arrogance had made them blind to the danger gathering at their gates. They would soon discover that the honorable hand of the king was not merely a man of justice and loyalty, but a wolf in the shadows, waiting to strike with precision, cunning, and an unwavering resolve. The time for subtlety was drawing to a close, and the moment of decisive action would determine not only the fate of the Lannisters, but the future of all those Ned held dear. The long months of careful planning and subtle manipulation had brought Ned Stark to the edge of the moment he had been waiting for. The Lannisters, once seemingly untouchable in their wealth and power, were fraying at the edges, driven by paranoia, suspicion, and the invisible pressure of a hand they had believed to be loyal. Every interaction, every carefully planted rumor, every minor misstep he had orchestrated now converged into a singular opportunity, a chance to strike decisively without revealing the depth of his own cunning. The Red Keep was tense that morning. A fragile calm covering the undercurrent of uncertainty that Ned had spent months cultivating. Cersei's sharp gaze darted from ally to ally, her suspicions turning even the most devoted supporters into potential traitors. Jaime, frustrated and impatient, made a subtle mistake in strategy during a council meeting, questioning the loyalty of a northern bannerman who had been nudged by Ned to appear wavering. Tywin, ever calculating, tried to maintain control, but the cracks in his household were now impossible to ignore. Each reaction played directly into the plan Ned had designed, and the timing could not have been more perfect. Ned had arranged for a series of private encounters and council sessions that forced the Lannisters to expose their insecurities and overreactions. Subtle provocations escalated into minor confrontations, and in the chaos, Ned carefully guided the outcomes to his advantage. A misplaced letter, a whispered accusation, and an overheard conversation combined to make Cersei believe that her closest allies might betray her at any moment. Jaime, his temper fraying, lashed out, further destabilizing the Lannisters' authority. Tywin, attempting to intervene, found himself cornered by circumstances that seemed to spiral beyond his control, while still being unaware that every detail had been orchestrated by the hand he so mistrusted. Ned's network of influenced courtiers and minor lords now acted with confidence, emboldened by small manipulations and subtle hints. They pressed the Lannisters into decisions that only deepened internal conflict, creating a perception of disorder that could no longer be ignored. The Lion family's reputation for unshakable power began to crack under pressure, their carefully maintained facade of unity faltering in plain sight of those trained to notice. For Ned, the final phase required patience, precision, and a profound understanding of human nature. He had observed the weaknesses of the Lannisters for months: Cersei's paranoia, Jaime's arrogance, Tywin's pride. Each of these traits became a lever he could pull at the right moment, forcing decisions that would weaken them further without ever implicating himself. The first blow fell subtly, yet it had immediate consequences. A council session meant to address a military matter turned into a public display of Lannister discord. Jaime's rash accusation against an ally prompted Cersei to lash out, accusing another of disloyalty in a fit of paranoia. Tywin, attempting to restore order, overcompensated, questioning his own supporters and sowing distrust where none had existed before. The controlled chaos was exactly what Ned had predicted. The fractures were widening, and the Lannisters were beginning to turn on themselves. Outside the council chambers, Ned's influence continued to ripple. Minor lords, encouraged subtly through letters, conversations, and veiled hints, began to align with northern interests, acting with boldness that further destabilized the Lannisters' court. The web Ned had woven for months now operated with its own momentum, as uncertainty, fear, and pride fueled the family's unraveling. Even Robert, blissfully unaware of the unfolding danger, provided opportunities for missteps that Ned could exploit. His impulsive commands, careless remarks, and distractions allowed Ned to maneuver the pieces of his plan into position, ensuring that each Lannister miscalculation furthered the wolf's strategy. That evening, Ned convened a private gathering with several key allies, both from the north and from the subtly influenced courtiers in King's Landing. Together, they reviewed the progress and coordinated the final steps that would cement the Lannisters' downfall. Each ally understood their role in advancing the illusion of independent events, acting as instruments of the plan without realizing the full scope. The Lannisters were now reacting to circumstances created entirely by Ned's foresight, their decisions driven by fear, pride, and doubt rather than reason. As night fell, Ned reflected on the delicate balance he had maintained between honor and necessity. Every decision had required moral compromise, every subtle manipulation a burden on his conscience. Yet he reminded himself that the safety of his family and the North justified these actions. He had remained vigilant, patient, and disciplined, and now, after months of effort, the outcome was within reach. The climax came when Tywin, desperate to reassert control, demanded explanations for the series of disruptions, accusations, and apparent betrayals that had plagued his household. Cersei's paranoia and Jaime's frustration erupted openly, creating a spectacle that revealed the true depth of the Lannisters' internal discord. In that moment, Ned presented carefully selected evidence of the disloyalty he had manufactured, documents and testimonies that seemed to confirm the suspicions already planted in the Lannisters' minds. Tywin's attempt to rationalize the situation only exposed more flaws, as the carefully engineered incidents aligned perfectly with Ned's design. The Lion family, for all its wealth, cunning, and pride, was forced into defensive positions, their authority weakened, their alliances strained, and their reputation shattered. Ned remained calm throughout, offering counsel and guidance that appeared impartial yet further reinforced the perception of Lannister instability. His reputation for honor shielded him, preventing suspicion of his role in orchestrating the chaos. By the end of the week, the Red Keep was abuzz with rumors of Lannister vulnerability. Courtiers whispered about internal conflicts, alliances shifted subtly toward northern interests, and even minor lords once loyal to the Lannisters began to hedge their bets. Ned's careful, patient work had paid off. The Lannisters' pride and ambition had been weaponized against themselves, and the Northern Hand had orchestrated their fall without shedding unnecessary blood. In the quiet that followed, Ned allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. He had acted as a wolf in the shadows, patient, cunning, and deliberate, while maintaining the appearance of honor and loyalty. His family, Winterfell, and the North were safer because of his efforts. The Lannisters had underestimated him at every turn, and that underestimation had been their undoing. Ned knew the consequences of discovery had been severe, but his meticulous planning had ensured both their defeat and his continued protection. The North would endure, his family would remain secure, and the balance of power in Westeros had shifted subtly but significantly in favor of honor, patience, and strategy. As Ned gazed out over the city from the Red Keep, the lights flickering in the evening haze, he felt the satisfaction of a plan executed with precision. The Lannisters, blinded by pride and ambition, had fallen into a carefully constructed trap, and the wolf remained unseen, waiting to defend those he loved and the values he held dear. In that moment, Ned Stark understood the true power of patience, cunning, and strategic foresight. Honor and strategy, when combined with patience and a deep understanding of human nature, could achieve what brute force could not. The Lannisters had been weakened, their unity shattered, and the North secured. The long months of manipulation, observation, and calculated risk had culminated in a victory that was as subtle as it was decisive, and Ned Stark, the honorable man and secret strategist, had ensured that the Game of Thrones had shifted irrevocably in favor of the wolves of the North. The city beneath him was a dangerous place, filled with treachery and ambition, yet for the first time, Ned felt a quiet certainty. The Lannisters had underestimated the wolf, and Westeros would remember that even in a world dominated by lions, patience, strategy, and honor could topple the most formidable foes. His plan complete, Ned returned to his chambers, knowing that the battle was not over, but that the lion had been wounded, its roar weakened, and its shadow diminished. And for the Starks, the North, and all who valued honor and vigilance, that was a triumph worth every calculated risk, every moment of deception, and every moral compromise that had brought them to this point.